work? It worked, right? I'll be walking around even a bit more. I'll try not to hide behind. I don't know. You can see. Okay. I'm moving from the broader topics that Andrea rightly addressed to a bit more focused view. I'll be talking specifically about active labor market policy, so we're talking about specific labor market intervention, but then placing them, well, on the one hand, to some methodological debate about randomized controlled trials in that field and in general, and then some an overview of the results of what we know about the effectiveness of these policies. Okay. Well, to start, we can motivate first why are we talking about active labor market policies at all? Why are we implementing these policies? You all know versions of this kind of graph. We see unemployment rates for a set of countries over the last 20 years. We all know that with crisis, unemployment surged in many countries, for example, Spain, Italy here as well, and it will be Ireland. You all know these figures. We know this is a graph that looks at the comparison of adult and youth unemployment. You all seen versions of this as well. I like this version. What it shows is that even pre-crisis. Now, obviously that hasn't changed, but this is a consistent pattern we've seen for the last decades. Comparing adult and youth unemployment. So if they were equal in a country, the country placed on this line, if it's about 2 times as large, then this will be the line, right? And you see, the majority of countries is further is above that line. So it's a consistent pattern that we see across countries. Youth unemployment typically at least twice as large as overall adult unemployment. It also is also more sensitive to business cycle movement. So here's the adult unemployment rate elasticity. So how does adult unemployment respond to changes in GDP? And there, it's the same for the youth. Again, we can draw a line where this will be the same sensitivity, and this will be where it's a stronger sensitivity. Again, the countries are above that, indicating that, so first of all, we know that youth have higher unemployment rates in the first place, and if we move into a recession, they will be harder hit by the recession than the average level workers. Okay, so the starting point of why we're talking about active labor market policy is basically unemployment, and specifically youth unemployment, is one of the most challenging economic and social problems, both in the developed and the developing world. Policymakers struggle or like to know what are effective programs to help jobless find jobs, increase their earnings, the probability of being employed, and job training and other agencies have been promoted, suggested as one possible remedy to this issue, cyclical and structural unemployment. This goes back to the early US experience, the Manpower Development Training Act in the 1960s and a couple of other acts since. So that's sort of the origin of training programs and active labor market policies. In Europe, you all know several examples. Basically, Sweden has been a vanguard of this since the 1970s, Germany at least since the 1990s, and Denmark, known for the flexicurity idea, the New Deal in the UK in the 1990s, etc. Was accompanied by the 1994 OECD job study, which for the first time called for specific action in this regard, using active labor market policies to combat unemployment, and of course also in the European Commission, I think has been one of the key issue to use active labor market policies. Back then it was called the European Employment Strategy, changed the name a couple of times. Lisbon Strategy, now it's what Europe 2020 still, I guess. Okay, so. But doesn't, in essence, well, my interpretation doesn't really change the key idea, right? So even for the OECD, they restated that, what they said in '94 already, they restated that in 2006, they restated job strategy, and then they focused that under this label of activation that we all know now as a bit more of a kind of a broader frame, where we think that this is the nucleus of policy intervention towards the unemployment. Regarding both passive benefits and active labor market policies. So in a sense, you could think that we see that ALMP historically precedes activation. If you think about it, actually activation logically precedes ALMP. In the sense it's the broader concept, and now we make that our active labor market policy. In other regions, there are several other experiences with job training. Okay, we have a couple of key policy questions now that we know that these policies have been in place for quite a while. What do we know about which type of these active program works? Can we say anything about short run, long run effect? Do these policies work better for some groups, maybe in some places, maybe in some times? Are there possible effects on non-participants? This is something where we intervene, maybe at the expense of some other people in the market. So these are some key policy questions, and these I want to address during the talk today. So the goals for this talk: first, I'm going to give you a basic or very basic framework of how we think about how these policies actually work. So before we start discussing what's being done, what we know about the evidence, I will first try to frame this and think about, okay, how do we think these policies work, and what does that stand to mean for possible effectiveness programs. In the second step, I'll focus a bit on the issue of how do we evaluate counter-effective evaluation of single programs. And this is a bit of some methodological debate. I'll present a bit about this issue. So should we do random assignment versus other methods where the state is in this regard. In the third part, I'm going to summarize what we know. Are the evidence of ANP mostly coming from meta-analysis to summary results and some conclusions now. Okay? Right, so we start with the framework. So of how do we think about active programs? Typically, we put them into 4 categories. So the first one would be the job search assistance. So all kinds of programs that try to get people to increase job search efficiency. The second type are training programs. That, in a sense, is kind of the classic active labor market program. That's where the whole idea comes from. So we teach unemployed, we give them new skills, and through that accumulated human capital, we think that they find jobs at higher rate. The third category summarizes basically wage subsidies and self-employment assistance. These are called private sector incentives, where you, mostly through a financial incentive, what you want to do, you want to alter either worker or firm behavior. So this is what these policies target. Then the fourth category would be the public sector employment. So basically, the public sector directly creates jobs and puts people to work. So there's versions of these categories, but typically these 4 is what we use. Clearly, some of these programs may be targeted at specific groups, often the youth, sometimes the disabled, and there's some other programs that are considered kind of hybrid versions. For instance, short-time working arrangements that have been used heavily in some countries in the last recession. So this is something, in a sense, the wage subsidy, but it has some link to the passive system. So it's kind of a hybrid policy that you could frame it. Okay, so so these policies are complement passive programs or alternative. Typically seen as a complement. They interact with the passive system. What's the basic goal? The basic goal is we want to raise participants' employment. This is the key objective that these policies have. And this is also the thing that when we look at evidence, what studies analyzing the effects look at employment practices. Your other possible goals, on a more aggregate perspective, you want to increase job creation, you want to improve the matching of the supply and demand of the labor market, you might be interested in lower government costs because you want to identify the most efficient policy. And of course, there was also an issue of you might want to raise participants' social welfare. With a question mark, is this really a key goal of this policy? But of course, it was only about getting people moving and lowering government costs. You might want to cut benefits, and then so the issue that you actually want to help people is also a key issue. And it's increasingly these policies are now passed into this activation framework through rights and duties regimes, right? So we offer policies that we make them compulsory at some stage, and interacts with in some way with the benefits that unemployed has. Okay, so just 4 brief slides on how do we think this works. So if we do job search assistance, so we want to raise the search effort, efficiency, people find jobs more quickly, identify a fitting job for them. We do that through job search training, counseling, monitoring, even sanctions can be a means to getting people into searching for jobs. So these are types of JSA. So you would nudge the procrastinator. So that's part of the idea, the activation factor. So the implication of this is, well, what can you expect? Essentially, you can only expect a short run effect of this, because what you do is you try to improve the matching points to get people into jobs. But unless this also changes preference or the employability through what we hope the job ladder effect, there will be no medium or long term effect. Right? So you get them in jobs, So we'll see later on empirically if the matches this point. There's some risk of a displacement effect, and I'm using this displacement now as a generic term for the effects that these programs may have on other people, right? So we know there's displacement, substitution, dead weight. So all these ideas that, well, maybe I help someone, but maybe he would have found a job by himself. So why would I then want to spend money on it? Or maybe I help someone at the expense of someone else. Maybe they get the job, but without the policy, some other person would have gotten the job. Or maybe through subsidies, a firm who's receiving subsidies gets into a better market position than competitors who are not receiving the subsidy. Again, there may be distortionary effects of what you do. You may help participants, but you may hurt other people in the market. And I summarize this under this idea of displacement, right? And of course, also this job assistance may have a low or some risk of displacement effect if there's a very low demand market. Yeah? So the people would be in good position to find and identify the jobs on their own. At the same time, these policies can have a very important role in two situations. First, in situations where there's a big restructuring of the economy, and you have potential information failures in the market, so people don't know where are jobs, how do I find a job. So that's an important, and at the same time, during recessions, also rapidly changing environment, where you might need information on where are jobs, how do I find these jobs. So then this policy can play. Okay, training. We want to raise human capital, we want to attenuate skills mismatch, and we do that through a series of components. It can be all of these, it can be a lot of the training program, sometimes the classroom, occasional technical training, it can be focused more on work practice, you're actually doing something in a firm, it can be based on basic skills training, math, language, for instance, or recently there's many programs that focus on life skills, socio-affective, non-cognitive skills. You know, showing up on time, feeling responsible for what you do, etc. So, depending on the program, it can be all components of these are conventional. So, what does this imply? Well, first of all, training takes time. So, there will be some negative effects in the short run, because if you put somebody into a training program for 6 months or a year, you would hope that the person stays in the program, starts looking for a job afterwards. So, in during this time, then called the lock-in effect, the employment rate of this group will be lower than of a comparison group, right? Because they're in the training program for some time. But the immediate thing like the job places. But hopefully through human capital accumulation, we would expect long-run effects that are positive and large. Of course, there wouldn't be, we teach people something that's obsolete or useless, right? So, of course, the content of the training matters. And this will have some kind of a place. Okay. The private sector environment here, we want to do job matching, so two-way subsidies, for instance, we want to increase labor demand. There will be some limited human capital accumulation, and something we could call the culturalization effect. I mean, put people first subsidy on a job so they get accustomed again to being on the job. Again, this applies. We would actually only really expect a short-run effect of this, because once the subsidy runs out, then what happens? Again, we hope that maybe job level effect people prove their employment viability while being on the job, but it's not necessarily implied by the design of the policy. This has a relatively high risk of a displacement effect. Running subsidies, you've got to be really sure that you're not subsidizing something at the expense of other people or subsidizing jobs that wouldn't be created in the absence of a policy. But it may play an important role as a version of the short-term working arrangement in the recession. In some countries it did, in Germany, okay, finally, public sector employment. Well, the purpose here really is rather than building human capital, it's more trying to prevent human capital deterioration during the spell of unemployment, possibly increasing demand, and often it's used as a kind of a safety net of last resort type of policy. The implications of this, again, we would only expect a short-run effect while the jobs are being created, public employment is being created, but since there's no human capital generation, what we expect, there might be work changes, changes in the preference or future employability through accumulated experience, but maybe this is not very likely. Again, high risk of displacement, and often these jobs, making jobs, are not very close to the labor market, so it's not clear once they end, how do they connect to an actual employer. Okay, so summing up these four slides, with some introductory information on these policies. We can do a very rough framework. When we think about these four types of policies, you can think, okay, this is something that's typically relatively cheap, this is medium to high, these are expensive policies. What can we expect in the short run? This will be positive. Positive is likely negative. We will lock in positive. It's somewhat unclear, and then we can distinguish the best case, worst case scenarios and see how we expect these policies to work, as well as the display series. In terms of relation to the business cycle, probably for this group you can make a case almost any time. For here as well, but these particularly make sense during a recession, because the recession, when the unemployment pool is larger, the opportunity cost of alternative job search is much lower, so it makes more sense to expand these policies in a recession, which is not necessarily saying they're being more efficient or more effective in a recession, but it makes more sense to implement them. And the public employment as well, because that is mostly safety net type of policy, things that we've seen in several countries now, in the United States, in Germany. Right, okay, so much for kind of background. How do we think labor market policies work? And later on we get back to see how does it actually fit with the results that we want to get in the second part, I'll talk a bit about evaluating these policies. So how do we assess the effect of a single program? We run a training program somewhere, we run a job search system. And this issue has been controversial from the beginning. The beginning means the 1970s in the US, right? Because that's when the earliest serious evaluation started, mostly that probably actually felt in the 1970s, late 1970s, who was one of the key actors there to identify the selection problems we need to address. There's a participant selection driven by a combination of self-selection, program rules, incentives, program operators. This is actually a thing that, well, it's important in any case, and whenever you evaluate NLP, it's maybe even a bit more important in the US, where you often have voluntary programs, whereas in the European context, often a program, the selection into the program is driven by much more strongly driven by program rules and things that you can control for if you have demonstrated data. It's more of a footnote. So he identified for the first time there this key question there: how would trainees perform in the absence of training? And that led to this idea that we need experiments to evaluate these policies. So how would they perform with the counterfactual? I think we're talking about counterfactual impact evaluation for these 2 days. Who here knows what a counterfactual is? Everybody knows? You can do what I do that. Who's heard the word counterfactual before? Everybody knows. Who thinks he or she knows what it is? Almost everybody. Who would be willing to say into this microphone what they think it is? Who wants? Yes, very good. No. Sure, we're on the same page when we talk about counterfactual.
I'm not saying so. Okay, but I think the counterfactual is what would happen in the absence of an intervention. What would happen regardless of the training intervention?
Yeah. With a participant, right? That would be, yeah, exactly. That's the perfect definition. So this is what we're looking at. We need 2 ingredients. So the challenge of what we're doing, what we value is the challenge of causal inference. And this is the one slide version of this. You can have, I think, probably 100 slides about this. But the very, very short version is, what we want to do is we want to establish a causal relationship between intervention and outcome of interest. So it's not about correlation, it's really about, we want to know the training program caused employment to increase, decrease data set. These 2 things. So we think about the world where the only thing we manipulate is training and the outcome. So we need 2 ingredients. So what's the factual one? You can call it factual, what happened to participants in terms of the outcome. That's the easy part, right? You have 1,000 people, you put them into training, after training, a year after training, 700 of them find a job, right? 1,000 people, a year after 700 find jobs. Right? So what does that tell me about the program? Has the program been a success? No.
Not necessarily.
Of course, we don't know. It sounds good, 700, right? 70%. But yeah, so that's the factual part. It's easy to measure that. What we need to know is what outcome would the participants have realized if they had not participated. So the key question there is the counterfactual. What would have happened in terms of the outcome to exactly these 1,000 people had they not been in the training? How many of these? And then, well, if it's 800, then we have a negative effect. If 600 was on the job, yeah, then it would be a little bit of an impact of 100 plus 100 on. And the difference, so the difference between these two that measures the causal effect. So basically, if we do it right, only two averages. Average employment rate of the participants with the program, average minus average employment rate of the participants without the program. Problem, it can only be either in the program or not in the program. So this is the key. So what the interest is to say something about what would happen to exactly these people. In the end, we try to measure this using control or comparison groups, but the control comparison group per se is never really interesting. Yeah? We only want to say something about this in the intervention, in the absence of the intervention. So clearly, this is a key, it's a great challenge. Yeah? We talked about two states of the world, where only one is actually realized and the other one we need to try and address in some way. But at the same time, it's pretty well understood. We know that the idea of random assignment, so you have 2,000 people, you toss a coin, 1,000 go into the training, and 1,000 don't go into the training. Because of this random procedure, these two groups will be the same on average in all characteristics, observable like age, education, gender, and also unobservable, motivation, ability. So we can compare these two. So the group that's randomized out gives us that information. We also know if we don't have random assignment, there are many settings where we have very good alternative techniques, quasi-experimental, non-experimental techniques. I don't know if I'm telling you too obvious things, or is it worth saying a bit more about this? What do you think? Do you think this is too obvious? Just move ahead. Do you think that? You think that? Okay. Anybody else is that just a bit 2-3 more minutes about this? No? Okay, then I'll do that. Okay. So we know that often RCTs provide the most convincing estimate of the counterfactual. This is a graph I took from JPAL. Who knows what JPAL is? Who's already? I don't know, right? That's the Jamil Abdul Latif Poverty Action Lab. Poverty Action Lab, that's the website. So there, currently have, just illustrating the number of RCTs only this institution is running. So I'm lending a bit now from the debate that goes on in development economics about RCTs versus non-RCTs. But there's a really big debate. And JPAL and then Esther Duflo is well-known, very famous economist. So she's involved there, and they are basically supporting this idea that in order to get causal effects of intervention, you need to do experiments. This is just to illustrate how many experiments are coming on the way. This is not only labor, this is also health interventions, etc. It's only one institution, there's many more. So around the world now, there's a multitude of experiments. Some of them think I don't know if there's any place anywhere in the world where you can go and there will not be some PhD student randomizing something. Yeah. We're definitely moving to that. This is a graph I took from CRIE. CRIE stands for International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. They cover both developing and developed countries, and they have what's called a collection of impact evaluation studies, repository of impact evaluation studies. And this is basically by year you can see how the number of impact evaluations increase. This is all types. So this is counterfactual in general, not only specifically NLP or OECD. So there's a surge in that. So in this current register repository, there are about 2,400 something studies, and of these, almost 60% are clinical trials. The majority of these, that's not surprising, are in the health sector. But the runners-up are education and social protection. They don't really break it down into this ALP category, so I cannot show you that use this data to using similar data in a second. And they say, okay, there's been a fundamental change. Another way now evaluations are common program implementation.
especially development economics, now where all sorts of determinants are tested worldwide, there's a certain that whenever you do something, you want it accompanied by evaluation, and in most cases, by a randomized trial. If we look specifically at LNP evaluations, so there's been this methodology debate as well. Starting in the US, like I said, we need experimental evidence, but we have a lot of advances in other experimental methods, matching, duration models, exogenous duration, natural experiments, etc. So there's been a lot, and it also has to be emphasized that a lot of these developments we've seen academically over the last 20 years, they've been made specifically in the context of labor market policy. So this kind of this prototypical training program is something that's been used a lot to do. Well, to come up with new ideas, to understand how matching estimators work, to understand how duration models work, etc. So there's a close link actually with the methodological development and specifically the question of the effectiveness of data. That has been also helped by increasing availability and quality of data. So, like you said previously, we're moving towards this evaluation culture. There's been a lot of movement that a lot of more interest by policymakers about results, about impact evaluations, and much easier access to this data from the right? The quality also, of course, with the computing power of the quality of data is much better than it used to be. I would probably still think, we're moving forward, clearly, big improvement, but probably still this evaluation is still kind of a piecewise. Like you mentioned, Santiago, the policy cycle, sometimes I think they also affect the kind of evaluation culture. There's times where there's more interest, and then there are times when this goes back. So just because we work at some level, that doesn't necessarily mean that 5 years later there's still something there. But in general, no doubt, the movement is forward. And so we have a large body of evidence now, many evaluations, many experiments now. We're also a growing database of precise impact estimates. I'm just going to show you this database. This is data, I'll tell you more about it later on in the results section that I gathered with colleagues on impact evaluation of ALP. And this is basically just to illustrate, so this is the total number of counterfactual impact evaluations we have this year. And year in this case means year of start of the program, not year of the study, but it means year of the study. Just to explain why we have these low numbers here, about 11, 12. These are just the programs that started then, and where there's already a study evaluating these programs. And here you can see the dark, these are the fraction of RCTs. And you see, basically, so there's this general trending towards more evaluation and ever higher fraction. Basically, for the last 10 years, it's going to be like say, 30%, and a third of all the evaluations are going to be experiments. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Now, just very briefly about this controversy about randomized experiments. I'm like I said, I'm lending this a bit from the debate in development economics, where it's a real big controversy. I'll show you more about this. I'm not so sure that's the case also in labor economics or labor market policies. I often have to think that most of my colleagues, myself included, we wouldn't doubt the idea that, okay, if we have a chance to do an experiment, we still would think this is the best way to go. I don't know. Does everybody agree, or is there any, do we have an experimentation skeptic? I won't force you to drink from the gardens, you may, but I'm just curious, is that, if we're all, I'm preaching to people who are already converted to experimentation. Okay, but here's how the controversy goes in the development economics. So on the one hand, we have these people, the fierce advocates of RCT. So these are people, for instance, who work at PayPal, there's other institutional innovations for poverty action, and they're called the randomistas. People call them the randomistas. Okay, so their point is, the assumption is that only experimental evidence, only RCTs will provide valid estimates of the policy. So anything else. So even to the point, there are people on panels that said, unless it's an experiment, I'm not interested. So the refusal flame out to accept or implement the experiment. And the key argument, of course, is the conceptual clarity of the method. Where it's a random assignment, if I do it well, all I need to do is compare it to the averages, right? There's no doubt there's a series of very important studies, and and a lot of many findings here that constitute evident knowledge gain. Yeah? So this is very obvious that we're moving a good way here. And moreover, it's challenged and very successfully challenged traditional thinking, at least in the developed economics. So this, on the one hand, there can be very strong points made. Okay, you need experimental evidence up to the point to say, unless it's experimental, it doesn't count. On the other hand, there are a couple of RCT skeptics or critics, and can read you some of their more substantive arguments. First of all, the main argument is the limited external validity, meaning that often these experiments are small scale in a very specific context. And you can say, okay, I may measure the impact very precisely in this context with this intervention, but does that really tell me anything about other contexts, other groups, other countries? Of course, external validity is an issue with every study, but here it's really brought forward specifically because many of the studies are small scale. They're expensive. There's one number I got from an encryption here, 500 education direction, I think it refers to World Bank and there's other development banks in the US. They say, hey, we have some 500 education direction that cost of $300,000 each. Then he said, okay, it's really hard to make the case that these $150,000 only spent on this experiment is the best way to possibly allocate these funds. It's a relative thing, right? I think that way it sounds a lot of money. We might use this money to run programs, but relative to 7 billion during a program, well, okay, you might as well spend 150 million on an experiment, right? Can I have that sign up, please? Yeah, and then they also say that, okay, so if it's true that RCT supposedly, that's also something that's brought forward as an advantage, if they supposed to constitute a pillar of this thing, this evidence-based policy making, why is there so little recourse to examine such processes from the social experiment in the US? So why are there so little? Well, I don't know if these examples exist, they're made, but in any case, there's very little recourse. There's very little stories where, okay, it was decided in an experiment, we find some results, as a result of this policy was redesigned. Like I said, these examples might exist, but we don't really talk about this a lot. So it's not really so clear, this is really the case, that we learn so much from experimentation in the long run. So I put this up as this is our learning curve. So here, this is in the previous data collection, this is 2010. We broke down the program by time period of program operation, and we look at the fraction of significant positive, negative. And of course, you think, I mean, 20 years, 25 years of evaluation, this curve should go up, right? You learn, you evaluate, you get results, we redesign policies. It's pretty flat, right? So, I give you later I'll show you, we have the updated version of it with more data. But then I thought, okay, it's not entirely bad news, because what we find systematically is that the earlier evaluation studies, they're often based on, well, not that well developed methods and often very rudimentary data. And they tended to estimate very large program impacts. So we think that there's actually an underlying trend that we don't see here, the fact that as we move to better methods and better data, estimates become more precise, and unfortunately that often means they will be much smaller than we first thought. So this is not entirely bad. The second thing that's sort of connected with the RCTs we work for evaluation. Of course, RCTs running them in parallel, there's a couple of practical problems. So different things that typically come up, we can have a whole presentation about ethical concerns, how practical is it, etc., etc. Of course, I don't know. It's hard to say whether these mice feel better. At least, well, I guess we're in the control group, but if we don't in the control group and this influences your behavior, you have these issues of Hawkins and the fact that no part of the experiment might change your behavior, therefore your outcomes. So there's a lot of practical problems when you're yeah, and then finally, this is more the academic perspective of it. Even so, if the perception is, so any academic knows that has a chance to experiment. Of course, I'm going to be what you haven't done the experiment. So it's I related this when I saw this graph to what's called the hype cycle. Remember, whether it's our RCTs, or the idea of running RCTs running through the hype cycle, something like a hype cycle, like other technologies. And this is what a consultancy that put up to say, okay, the science works. So there's a technology trigger. So in the beginning, something like big data, as an example here, is 2012. So we move forward here. And so it's something that everybody talks about. There's a new technology. This is really funky, okay, so technology trigger. It reaches the so-called peak of inflated expectations at some point, and then enters the trough of disillusionment. And then hopefully at some point move into a slope of alignment to a plateau of productivity. The idea is that at this phase, everything RCT is okay. Everybody's doing it. How can I not get on this? I really need to do an experiment. But then suddenly, everybody's doing experiments. Is this really enough? What's the value of yet another experiment, yet another program? Well, what were they thinking? So maybe we should, there will be maybe some fade out. So I think there's some trend also that it's become a very funky idea to run experiments in applied economic research. Well, it's up for discussion, right? But it's just a trend that will go away, or whether there's a serious need for continuing. Okay, just a very the intentional balanced view of this debate. It's very clear at the very least that these RCTs that we've seen and their advocates, that they've brought an enormous debate, dynamic to this debate. This is no doubt. Without these RCTs and their proponents, we wouldn't be there where we are in the debate on measure quality. And on this whole issue of this. And on top of that, they're many important findings, no doubt. And we also have to see that a lot of these developments that we've seen in experimental methods were made possible relative to the experimental benchmark. Right? So you use experimental data and you say, okay, using experimental data, I know what the real result is. Let's see whether I can reproduce it using alternative methods. So this is the idea going back to a long in the 1980s. So without these development experiments, we wouldn't be where we are with the knowledge. Yeah, and of course, this has given an emphasis to the idea of rigorous counterfactual calculations. That is generally very positive development, and there are several actors here that advance this inexplicable connection to the deprivation of policymakers. I put the European Commission there as an example. It's definitely the case. Another example there, more from the scientific part, I say, okay, we only fund projects that are both rigorous and have a clear communication strategy with policymakers. So we're not funding your experiment just because it's a very good experiment, but only if you can make plausible how you can communicate the results to decision makers and how those decision makers will act. So this is certainly a key, and this is a key aspect of this conference, right? Like you mentioned. Okay, yeah. So ultimately, in a balanced view, we think that okay, it's important to learn to investigate what works and what does not, but these cannot be monopolized. Okay, right. That was the methodology part. Now, some general lessons from the literature. I don't know how I'm running on time. Do you have time?
If you want
Okay, right. So there's a lot of spending on AMP. You can show the graphs. This is spending after the crisis, 1.5, 1% GDP. So this relevant measure. This is passive spending. So this is what's being spent on passive policies. Clearly, this goes up very strongly with the crisis, the function of unemployment. It's just to show you going back a lot to the done in terms of AMPs, and very briefly, you can also see that how this was affected by the crisis. So this is 2007 versus 2010, sorry, pre and post. some countries, Denmark, Germany, Ireland, and Spain. So first we look at Germany, almost no change in unemployment because of the crisis, therefore almost no change in passive spending. Very little change in the LP. I thought Denmark was always an example. Okay, there's been quite an increase in unemployment, so passive spending went up. But Denmark had put a lot more effort into the active labor market policies also during that recession. Right? You can see it doesn't look that big because I adjusted the scale so that they're the same, but it's actually quite a money spent. In countries like Ireland and Spain, passive spending surged because of the huge increase in unemployment. And you can tell from these figures, that my reading is that there was just very little fiscal room to move, to act in terms of active labor market policy, because there was so much spending, so much money going into the passive spending. Right? In any case, okay, still these countries, all countries run ALPs at a relevant level, so it's clearly something that's being done a lot. A lot of ALPs, a lot of evaluations, how the system works. So collect studies across the country. You can do that in 2 ways, so-called systematic reviews, or the more classic, what we call narrative review. There are papers here by Martin grew up in the OECD, and the OECD employment outlook, they regularly update that, not every year, but every now and then they do reviews of the evaluation literature. Or you can do what's called a quantitative assessment, essentially meta analysis. So we did this previous study here, one that was actually in this paper resulted from a study for the Commission. There are 3 studies from the US, Bloomberg economy, Bloom economy, interesting study. They don't have they have program data, individual level data from different sites. The same program runs in different places. And there's other examples, right? So what we put together all these data, gather a couple of hundred studies, and then we analyze this in a statistical way. We synthesize it to try and sample individual studies. All studies have been defined to analyze the use of evaluate. We're currently compiling a new sample. Like I said, this is from the partner at CRIE. And currently have 201 manufacturing impact evaluations, which is more than double the number we had in the 2010 study. We have 407 short-term impact estimates. So we're looking at short-term means that so after the program ends. So what's the effect in the first 12 months of the program? That's most programs, most evaluations estimate that. Some quite estimate what we call medium-term impact second year, and then one has information on longer-term impact after to see how sustainable is the impact that we identify. So we use this and we read all the papers, we extract information on all sorts of things, pros and cons, duration of the program, methods used, target group. In the end, it's correlated the effectiveness of the program with all these factors to see what is really the thing that makes the difference, that explains whether the programs have positive and negative impacts. So typically we look at whether a program finds positive and negative or only insignificant impact. This, of course, is a little way, it's a relatively rough classification because obviously also looking at the size of the effect. This is hard, it's not always possible. So we need so-called effect sizes where you can extract the coefficient and relate it to the average level of the control group post-treatment. This was extracted to our 40% of the estimates. Actually, when I wrote this, I read it, it looks small, it's actually not, it sounds small for you, it's not that bad, because this is the 40% for the old and the new sample. And now the new data collection for the most recent studies, they have much more information on this. The older studies, they don't report average outcomes of the control group, and it's impossible to track. Right, so this is a brief summary of what we're doing. So if we look at the estimates that are negative, 0, significant, positive, you can look at this short term, first year after the program, medium, and long. All 4 programs that we're doing. Yeah, you can see, for instance, here, training is by far the largest group. You can see more than about half of the information we have are from training programs. In the short run, about 20% report negative impacts, and that is even still, that's not the lock-in, it's already after the program ends. It's not during qualitative training relative to the control group comparison group, and afterwards. And there you can see if you look at this distribution of 20, 44, 0, 35, and then medium term gets ever more fraction of positive result gets ever increases. And this is pretty much true for all programs. If we relate this to what I told you in this basic framework in the beginning, I kind of think it's kind of surprising that the job search assistance, well, it's not surprising here. It maintains some effects in the medium run, some positive, but then it seems to be going down. The interesting thing is that the wage subsidy programs increasing and also very large fraction of long-run positive effects. Personally, I find it surprising. And the thing that the public employees generally seems to be a very tricky measure to bring about positive impacts. So this is something. We can look at this. The summary of the program type effect. So we find so training. If you look on average, it's modestly effective, but mostly in the long run. The private sector, you see these short and now even long run positive effects. Most of these studies don't address and constitution, so we can conclusively say this is really that good news, but it looks like good news in this analysis. The public sector, they're often not effective and even increase participants' chances, and the job search systems they often find positive effects. They also tend to be cost effective because they're the cheapest of the programs. Right? Sorry. A different way to look at this impact increase with time after the program is if we look at a sample, in this case only training, we did it for all programs together, and it looks very similar. That report both short-term and medium impact for the same program and the same participants. You can see this dynamic of how does this evolve. And the interesting thing, if you relate short-term and medium-term, you can see, okay, of those that were negatively significant in the short-term, they're 46% switched to at least 0, and another 46 or 47% are really positive in the medium-term. Right? And you can see this graph in the simple table that we found this in the previous data collection already. If there's a switch, it's always towards the better in the long run. So in the long run, programs tend to be more effective. So if we only measure short-run impacts, we miss a lot of the information of the program. We can do the same table. This is short-term with short-term and long-term, and you can see that it's 0, right? So the long-term switch is always towards the better. This is an update of this graph that I showed you previously, the learning curve, right? Do you remember that? In this case, for all the short-term impacts, and you can see here, this is the program operation in the 80s, early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, and up to now. It's not a very strong pattern, but it might interpret it kind of good news, that we actually see to be learning if you look at just these figures that the fraction of significant programs, this is relatively flat, but at least the kind of negative programs, they don't seem to be there anymore. So this could be cautiously interpreted as kind of good news of we actually are learning programs, maybe getting better. Maybe a word about this insignificant. So we have this insignificant category, and if you read through these papers, and maybe the fact also that because we're now increasingly having these randomized trials, often these the studies are quite underpowered. So, meaning that, what kind of effect size can you expect? We know from the education literature that say the return to a year of formal education is maybe something around 10%. Okay, now we'll do something ALMP. Probably even the best ALMP will do something that's at most comparable to that, but likely it's not. It's not the equivalent of a full-time year of formal education. So if you expect impacts of like 5 or 85 million, or even for vocational technical ALMPs, from systems like vocational training systems like Germany, the full formal system, also systems are around 10%, right? So impacts are likely smaller. And then you often have very relatively small sample sizes, and reading through the studies, you get the feeling that if impacts are small, many of the studies will not have statistical power to actually detect these small impacts. meaning they will all end up in this insignificant category here. So you're not, so this kind of hides the programs that are actually have zero impacts, together with the programs where the evaluation design just doesn't have enough power to detect the impact, right? We hope to be able to say more about this when we look at the effect size subset. We can do similar graph for this is the short term, so what happened to the fraction of the short term impact, we can do it for the medium term. There, it is relatively flat. Again, it is increased in the insignificant category that I just tried to interpret with the first interpretation. Here, the good news is that the fraction of negative significant runoff has been very low and very low. For the long term, these are only, I have to make, so, the word change. Okay. Can you hear me now? An hour later. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. So this is really just a handful of observations, so you can't really interpret this last. So if you can try to interpret up to here, and again here with long effects, you can see a very small fraction of zero basically of negative impact, and this maybe there's some. So the news aren't entirely bad. Just a brief overview of some of the main results from these analyses and from the literature. If you look at target groups, in general, they're not really strong effects by gender. However, the systematic effect, mostly we see that youth programs. Youth programs are systematically less effective. It's mostly true in OECD countries, to a lesser extent in developing countries, but it's a different debate. What does that mean? So there's probably two interpretations or implications. So first, it seems to point to the preventive intervention. So once you have a 25-year-old long-term unemployed with no secondary degree, probably it'll be too late to help him or her. So that points to the idea, okay, maybe we need to connect this better with educational policies. And the other issue is the relevance of labor market institutions. So because there's evidence that, specifically in the kind of two-tier or inside or outside the labor markets that are generated by employment protection legislation or minimum wages, this hampers program effectiveness, especially for the youth. So suppose that essentially these regulations generate something like a barrier into the market, and even if you have an effective program, you teach you skills and they increase their employability, they may still not make that barrier if it's set too high. So some thoughts about what that means. Regarding contextual factors in general, these labor market institutions for the overall populations, it's very difficult to identify them in studies. This correlation is not strong except this employment protection legislation. It's stronger for the youth, specifically the user effectiveness. Well, there's some experience or evidence from Germany that where we had these fundamental reforms. That if you improve and make more efficient your institutional framework, administrative organization, that can improve policy effectiveness. Looking at business cycles, we have relatively little evidence about that, how that correlates with ILMP effectiveness. There seems to be, in a few studies to look at this, some positive correlation between unemployment and ILMP effectiveness, which to some degree makes sense because during the session you have a relatively high-skilled pool of unemployed that might allow for better matches. And again, the point that I mentioned earlier, this makes sense to expand the LMP during the session, especially the programs with a large lock-in effect like training, this opportunity costs are smaller during the summer. Okay, finally, some conclusions and outlook. Talking very briefly about knowledge gaps first. Things we definitely want to know more about are first, how do we design the programs in terms of components? So is it the classroom training, the technical, the life skills? What is the thing that makes a difference? Do we always need to combine many components to have a good effect? Because there's evidence that comprehensive programs work, but what does that mean? What is the precise composition of a comprehensive intervention? And there's some literature on this issue of public versus private provision of services. That's for economists, it's been a key issue. We're moving, I think, forward on this to get a bit more conclusive evidence on who is the better provider of these active labor market policy services. Yeah, then probably a big field starting to be, will be this whole issue of displacement effects, to say something about substitution, dead weight displacement. Obviously, the empirical challenges are much bigger than only identifying direct effects, but as the study by Capon and others for France, it can be done. Another knowledge gap, so program duration, how long does a program have to be, where some, this is one study I did with colleagues from the German training program. This is the outcome of the control group, and this is by length of training. Very briefly, it just illustrates that after about 2 months of training, program effects, these are significance bands, become positive. They increase up to about 6 months, and then they flatten out, and then the estimates get very precise. And there's another study for the US that does that, and so there's some initial indication where they say, okay, at least you may need a certain investment of training, say maybe 2 or 3 months, and then, but after 6 months, there will be no additional effect if you make a program longer. This is just one country, one training program, we have one other country, but so we need to know more about that. Obviously, interest whether you, as a policymaker, want to invest in only 3 months of training or 6 or 12, right? So overall, the first glance, I think looking at literature, there seems to be quite a bit of bad news, because often we find programs don't work, they have negative effects, or they make it very small. The youth programs are particularly ineffective. Problem there, youth unemployment is the key challenge, right? It was mentioned already in the beginning, and there's all sorts of programs being thought about, youth guarantee, etc. So if you add to this outlook of the scarring effects of prolonged unemployment, even for the high skilled, this makes the problem even more bigger. And of course, this issue of life cycle recession, of entering the labor market during recession. So this would tend towards a bit more bleak outlook, but there is hope. So there are definite long-run indications of capital accumulation, so this active labor market policy can contribute to that. Job search assistance, typically cost-effective, plays an important role. The comprehensive programs work, even for youth. They're often expensive, that's the thing. I mean, if you look at one positive example, the Job Corps in the US, the program cost, that's at 19 million. 90s figure, it was $16,500 per year, so that's a lot of money for one person to generate impacts. Yeah, we need programs that are practical, linked to workplaces, carefully targeted, and clear. This interaction with the UI system is important, and with the institutions like EPL. Yeah, finally, broaden the evidence base in this connection, in this discussion between academics and policymakers, program managers. Of course, where does this information that I've given you a short overview of come from? So it comes from a sizable number of program evaluations. It's an ever-increasing number with an ever-increasing number of RCTs, and that's clearly a normal potential in this, in all programs that are being implemented and evaluated. So this is something we want to continue and foster and make sure that all interventions that are being run are actually designed to be evaluated. Then we get ever more systematic knowledge with ever-increasing potential to inform and blend into policy, backwards playing the ball back from the results I presented you to policy and decision makers. Right, thank you very much.